Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the webinar, Could We Have Helped Eleanor Rigby? How Does Loneliness Affect Persons Living with Mental Illness? My name is Suki Norris, and I will be leading this webinar today. I am a senior knowledge engineer with the ECHO group. You'll see a biography slide of me coming up, but in general, I've had about 35 years of experience in this industry, and during that time, I have studied pretty much all the kinds of issues that affect folks with mental illness, but also the kinds of things clinicians and agencies get to deal with because of just the challenges that arise. This webinar is being sponsored by the ECHO group. So you'll be able to submit questions on the bottom left of your screen at any point during the presentation. We'll be getting to all questions during the last 10 minutes of the program. Also, you can find a PDF of the presentation and additional resources under the headshot image located on the left of your screen. If you need any assistance, please email Melissa Pangaro at the address you see here. For NADAC credit, you must watch the program all the way through the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Do not leave the console. And you need to stay on the platform, and you'll be automatically redirected to an evaluation landing page. If this is your first time attending a webinar in 2019, you're going to need to create an ACME account where you are first directed to the landing page. For all subsequent webinars you attend, you'll already have an account and will just need to log in. After completion of the evaluation, you'll be able to download or print your certificate. NADAC credit is the only one offered for this live broadcast. So what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to define the terms. When we speak of loneliness, what do we mean? We're going to look at the risks, both behavioral health and physical health risks of loneliness. I want to spend a little time looking at some of those risks and seeing if loneliness is the cause of the risk or the byproduct of the risk. And then we're going to get to what can or should we do. And finally, there are questions and comments. In the PDF of the presentation, you'll find a full bibliography that includes all the information that I've reviewed in putting together this webinar. If you have any trouble getting access to any of the items, and if you want to read one of the references, please just contact me at the email address on the presentation, and I'll be able to get that article for you. Again, this is just a little bit about me, should you have any curiosity, but I'm going to just go past that and get started. So some thoughts on loneliness. I bet everybody recognizes at least one of these two pictures, but each of these people had something to say about loneliness. Emily Dickinson said that the horror cannot be surveyed when speaking of loneliness. Robin Williams said, I used to think the worst thing in life was to end up all alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel all alone. In both of these comments, you'll get a hint of the definition of loneliness. So if you say you're alone, what that just means is you're by myself. It indicates a choice of that kind of single being, of being by yourself. Loneliness, however, is a subjective isolation. As Robin Williams so adequately and eloquently put, loneliness can affect you when you are around many people. Social isolation is different in that it's an objective truth. You have few social connections. So if you are alone and have no one to reach out to, it is objective truth that you really are socially isolated. What's the relevance of all of this? Well, I'm going to have a couple of slides that look at how many people are in fact lonely. This is a study that was done in Europe, and you'll see that the line that is that's kind of faded, the dots, that shows loneliness through various ages. And you'll see that there are really two highs when you look at loneliness. One is at the time of millennials. The other is at old age. Those are generally true as you look at data. So what other kinds of percentages of loneliness? Cigna did a broad-based study of loneliness in the United States. This first graph speaks to sort of the various elements of loneliness for an entire population, not split out by age or any other factor. You'll see that 59% of people felt that their interests and ideas aren't shared by those around them. That gets down to a low of only 36% for people who feel there's no one they can turn to. But as you look at this graph, what you're going to see are elements of loneliness and what the percentage of Americans that feel that way always or sometimes. This is the population we're talking about, the population of people who feel that they are lonely and are without the social connections, or perhaps with the social connections, but unable to access them in a way that is satisfying. The next graph, the next slide, shows a little bit of breakdown of some of the numbers of just loneliness. Now you're going to see that really, as you look at Gen Z and millennials, that's really the high point of loneliness, and it gets lonely in the greatest generation. Interestingly done, at the same time as this study was done, Cigna also did regional studies, and they found, and I mean no disrespect if there are folks on the phone from these areas, but in Houston, residents are 6% more likely to be lonely than the national average of 54%. In Austin, you have the same difference, 6% more likely to be lonely, whereas in Tampa, folks are at 41% lonely compared to a national average of 54%. Towns that follow the national average include such towns as Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Baltimore, Denver, really most all the other regions within the United States. Now, please note that when you look at those averages, they begin to change when you look at youth between 18 and 34. They generally are higher than whatever the national average of their region are, and also by socioeconomic. People who feel they are more comfortable socioeconomically tend to be below the national average of loneliness. People who believe they are not safe or comfortable or are below that economic levels, in the lower economic levels and lesser economic levels, are more likely to be lonely by a fairly significant amount. So while these numbers look good, like all numbers, if you drill down into them, you may find some things that can raise further alarms about loneliness and what we need to do about loneliness. So what is the risk of social isolation and loneliness? The first set of risks are behavioral risks. They include such things as medication adherence, suicidal thoughts, alcohol abuse, and manufactured social experiences, meaning you are sort of creating your life rather than living in it. Now, one of the things, there are not a lot of studies, in fact, I could only find one, that looked at people who live with IDD-related challenges. They are found to, in addition to the behavioral health risks, have increased vulnerability to loneliness and its associated depression. So beyond just what the population is finding, when you get to the neuroatypical population, you're going to find an even greater incidence of loneliness and related depression. The next slide gives you a little bit of an idea of how these behavioral health risks affect a single diagnosis. In this case, the diagnosis of borderline personality. You're going to see that on the social networking side, in addition to the size of the social network, one of the challenges faced in this population is diversity in their social network. On the social functioning side, in addition to the withdrawal from social engagement, pro-social versus antisocial behavior, you're going to find a challenge with interpersonal communication. So it's important as you look at the effects of loneliness, you don't lose sight of the other diagnoses or the main diagnoses that clients have, because these can further the challenges that are faced, really enforce that concept of loneliness because of the nature of them, many different ways. But the sum total is, the more involved the client is, the more challenges that their loneliness is going to present. So those are the behavioral health risks. But there are also physical health risks: heart disease, arthritis, diabetes, dementia, blood pressure, obesity, and smoking. These are the health risks that are more pronounced in people who are lonely. One of the reasons I began studying loneliness was the often described statement that people with mental illness die 25 years earlier than people without mental illness. And I thought about that, and I did some research. And what I think is a good question, but an open question, is the mortality rate the effect of loneliness or the effect of the mental illness? Many folks believe that it is in fact the effect of the loneliness. It is that loneliness that causes that mortality rate. It is the loneliness that causes a person not to seek help, not to get taken care of, not to do the things that we might otherwise do if we weren't lonely. And that's why I think it's really important that we never lose sight of what loneliness means. So in the introduction, I did say I was going to talk a little bit about the root relation, which came first. As an example, loneliness is linked to poor cognitive function. But poor cognitive function did not lead to the loneliness. While social isolation and loneliness seem very similar, they are in fact not correlated at all. One may exist without the other. It makes sense that one could exist without the other, but I question, in a socially isolated situation, which is objective, a person without social connections and all, aren't they more likely to be lonely than a person who has social connections, is not living in social isolation? That may create a greater concept of connection between those two than many of the studies have found. And finally, and really quite importantly, loneliness is both a risk factor and a consequence of depression. If you are depressed, you are more likely to be lonely. If you're lonely, you are much more likely to be depressed. It is that relationship that I think shouldn't be lost, whether you're dealing with an adolescent, a millennial, or an elderly person. I think it's also important to note right now that while loneliness increases health risks and behavioral health risks, there are no quality measures that are being used by CMS or NCQA that look directly to the loneliness of the individuals. Yes, they look to depression and other mental health diagnoses, but if loneliness is a key factor in mortality, in your physical health and your behavioral health, isn't it interesting that there are no quality measures that provide a direct linkage to that state of being or feeling, or that subjective truth for the folks who are feeling lonely? So work needs to get done. We are a lonely population. We are really not addressing it in any way, but they're models from across the world that show the advantages of what can be done if you want to address loneliness. But before we get there, do we understand? So, like so many other things, there is a problem that we have in the United States that comes before our ability to treat loneliness, but comes before our ability to be responsive to loneliness. It is that 46% of people in this country, almost half, believe that lonely people only have themselves to blame. So I ask you, as we speak of solutions, as we think about ways we can address loneliness in this country, how do we do it if almost 1 out of every 2 people believes that loneliness is in your head and isn't a true thing, isn't a real diagnosis, as it were? Where people have not had that problem, where the belief that loneliness is true and a real state of being, people have been able to put programs together. The most notable one is what can be done in Britain. What they've done here is a countrywide focus on loneliness and combating loneliness. And how they have done it is as broad as your imagination can be. This is a picture of a neighborhood lunch. So one of the solutions is just bringing people out and having lunch together, letting people get to know each other. Another solution was called the door knocking campaign. Volunteers went out into cities and knocked on every door and made a connection to the people that lived behind that door. Those connections may have caused people to come to this lunch. Perhaps they've just gone out for a walk together. Maybe they just go back and visit once a week. But the start was to find folks, to identify folks, and to make folks feel included. Nobody questioned their loneliness. Merely they questioned they gave them an opportunity to be engaged. And they understood a fundamental truth. A single engagement will not stop people from feeling lonely. Trust and connection and an ongoing relationship may begin to undermine the subjective feelings of loneliness and have people feel socially included and involved. It's kind of explained by this infogram that shows the holistic approach that was taken to dealing with loneliness in England. It included reaching out. It included something fundamental. People had to understand that loneliness was real for the people who said they were lonely, and address it as something real and probably scary to those people. Because the effects of loneliness are depression, and serious things come from that depression, including suicide and other, and the unwillingness to go on in your life. People had to understand that, and to bring people back in, to provide in some ways a lifeline to folks that was safe and secure and continuous. It was support. It was finding existing relationships, creating new connections, changing thinking, both of the lonely person and of the people that were helping those folks. And it was as broad as you can imagine. In one neighborhood, a garden was planted, and it was the community garden, and everybody had a stake in that garden. And it was found that while at first people came out because they were told to come out, in essence, as time went on, they wanted to be there. And the volunteers found folks gardening who had never left their house before. Now, maybe gardening isn't going to work in an urban neighborhood. Maybe it will. But thinking about ways, but what they did is they looked at their neighborhood and came up with a solution that could meet people where they were as they were. And it's worked. The decreasing of loneliness in Great Britain has been really been very significant since these approaches began. And it should be a sign to us, and it has been in Canada, in Scandinavia, in other countries. But for reasons that I find hard to understand, we've been less open to the possibilities here. Now, there have been some programs. The first few you see, the Oprah Winfrey program, one by AARP, one to the Oshkosh program is interesting. It asks you to go out to that website and you have two choices. You can put in how you feel about loneliness or what you think you can do for someone to help them with loneliness. And it starts that connection using technology, but at the end using person-to-person connection. The Togetherness program is an interesting one. This is a medical practice that screens for loneliness every time a person comes into the office. If loneliness is identified, there is an active campaign. There are phone calls made. There are home visits made. They create an informal social hub. Now, this is focused mostly on at-risk seniors, but as a program, it could be used with adolescents. It could be used at a college campus. It can be used in your neighborhood. It is the core of a basic program that says, if you're lonely because I've identified you as lonely, we're now going to do what we can to involve you in your treatment. We're going to get involved with your life. You're going to know that we're going to be there for you and you are not alone, and we're going to start to combat your loneliness. It's just the core way of reaching people. It really just makes a lot of sense, I guess. If a person is lonely, if a person is isolated, to break the bonds of that loneliness, you connect, you create trust, and you make a person know that they are always going to have somebody there. There are stories of a senior who was shut in and really had no connections whatsoever. A volunteer went and just after the door knock met her and said, you know what, I'm going to come back in a couple of days. And a couple of days went into several months, and several months is now about 5 years. Once a week, this volunteer goes to the shut-in's house, talks to them, maybe takes them out for a walk, maybe helps them get to the doctor, may help them understand medicine or something, but mostly has connected and given that person, the shut-in, something to look forward to. It's really a simple concept. It's just about us treating others sort of like we like to be treated, with respect, with trust, with continuity. A geriatric doctor at UCSF talked about doing such things and said, you know, I used to go make house calls, and then I got really busy and I couldn't. So maybe I did video chat, or maybe I just called my clients. And I found that they just weren't doing well, that they weren't engaging with me when I called them. And I realized that it was that face-to-face visit that gave my clients the ability to tell me what was going on with them. My patients were more honest with me, trusted with me, were more straightforward with me. So for me to provide the kind of care I needed to provide, I really had to have face-to-face meetings with folks. It's an important thing to realize, no matter what your age is, You want that face-to-face connection. Schools in some areas have done a lunch buddy. They identified kids who are always eating alone, and folks and other kids volunteer to be their lunch buddy, so they'd always have somebody to eat with. The importance of that is untold in the lives of these kids. And wouldn't it be great if one of these kids grew up, did a door knocking, and became a friend of one of their elderly neighbors? If we start this process, if we engage in this process, we may find that the end result is something that allows us to do this without government involvement, but just because it brings our socialness, the socialness of each of us, to the foreground and helps us deal with those who may not have that same ability right now. So one of the often studied these days is social media. It's hard to say whether it's a hurt or a help when it comes to social isolation, because for every study that says it's a detriment to socialization to folks, there's another study that says it's just fine. It's the way people communicate now. Digital native, these kids in of that generation, this is how they do it. We used to perhaps talk on phones. Maybe we all got together in a car. Social media is the new method of communication. And there are studies that say it's fine. It does not increase loneliness. It does not increase social isolation. And then there are studies, of course, that say it does. And it's hard to know what the truth is. So let me step into a couple of truths that I do feel comfortable with. First of all, social networking is a part of our lives. There is 68% of adults have Facebook accounts. Parenthetically, I've been told by my 20-year-old that Facebook is not cool, so only us old folks will use it. Don't mean to say anything about that, but I'm just saying maybe that's why 78% of young adults use Snapchat and 71% of them use Instagram. Could be the reason. That's not my area of expertise, so I'm not sure. But one of the things to know is that Snapchat has apps that can be used in it. One of them is YOLO. There are no numbers about how many people use YOLO, but there ought to be concerns and red flags for that, because YOLO is a place where you can anonymously ask questions, you can anonymously, harass people, bully people, be mean, let your best side come forth or your worst side come forth, and nobody can track you down, which is related to cyberbullying. Of course, there's an increase in cyberbullying just because of the increase of use of social media. Social media can bring out our very worst, and that very worst can be used to attack other folks. But an interesting thing to remember is that just because a person is bullied in the cyber world doesn't mean that person should leave the cyber world. It is quite possible that some of the best places to deal with the effects of cyberbullying are other social network platforms. And it has been found that people who have suffered from cyberbullying have more often than not been able to get help and support outside of those social medias, but in safe social areas. So it's an interesting thing to think about as perhaps a client or someone you care about suffers the effect of cyberbullying. Where that should get resolved may be very much a part of who that client is and what might work for them. A study was done using social media at a college campus, and somebody once told me that it's easy to do studies at college campus because psych students sort of have no choice but to volunteer to participate in the studies. And so this was a study of 148, I believe, kids in a psych class or classes. They were split into two groups. One group continued using social media just as they always had. The other group was allowed to use social media, each platform, 10 minutes a day. So Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, but only 10 minutes a day for each one. At the beginning, the researchers looked at two factors. They have provided a depression assessment to determine the level of depression, and they used the UCLA loneliness to figure out the level of loneliness. They then tested these kids every couple of weeks. And what you'll see on the right side is there was an absolute reduction of loneliness and depression in the college kids who only use social media for a prescribed time every day. I'm not sure how you can extrapolate it, but it's important to note that it is conceivable that while social media is not in and of itself a bad thing, maybe reducing the amount of time we spend in social media is an answer to both loneliness and depression. The next slide gives you a comparison between countries, but also some information about the difference in loneliness with people who use social media more than 2 hours a day. The dark blue numbers is the increased loneliness, and those folks who said they were lonely, the light blue is who said they were not lonely or there was no effect on loneliness. And you're going to see a couple of really interesting things in this study. First off, it is the United States that has the highest degree of loneliness for those 2 hours of all three countries, and also the biggest distance between those who identified themselves as lonely and those who didn't. And you'll see how the other countries also fared in that. It's just an interesting study when put together with the prior slide. People have to make their own decisions when it comes to the use of social media, but the way to think about this is just because you use social media and you're not lonely doesn't mean that other people who do the same may not be suffering from loneliness. And it's just remember that the people next to you may not be just like you, even though you do the same things and you're working with the same tools. I have heard one too many stories when you talk about this of people who present one way in their work environment, in their school environment, but are in a dangerous place the minute they're alone. Are those folks suffering from a kind of a profound loneliness that even the engagement of schools and or work aren't addressing? Or are the people at work, or us who are at work and us who are at school, not really seeing the signs of loneliness, of depression? And is there a way to advance both of us in that? So what can we do? First thing I want to talk about are some loneliness scales that you might want to incorporate if you don't use already. I've done webinars where I have suggested that the PHQ-9 is an important test. Well, here I would say there are 3 different possible scales you can use. None of them take a long time. None of them are overbearing, but each of them serves a purpose, and each of them can provide you with an indication of is your patient lonely. Remember when I discussed what other programs that are being done, it started with the UCLA loneliness scale. 3 simple questions. Now this is probably the most widely used scale. In fact, it's part of the English longitudinal study of aging. So it is a very large population who are being tracked using this scale. And this can be used for any age group that we've been talking about loneliness, from adolescents to geriatrics. Another scale is the De Jong six-item loneliness scale. This is primarily used in Europe and not in the United States, and it presents something interesting. It is actually looking at both emotional loneliness and social loneliness as two different constructs of loneliness. It's designed for older people, and I want to say before I repeat myself one more time about design for, there was a perception, and there is a perception, that loneliness affects the geriatric population the most. If you take away nothing else from this talk, please understand that that is not the truth. While it does affect geriatrics, it is equally affecting the millennials and young adults. And people will be study that and provide it. It's easier to understand in the elderly, but having a college-age daughter, I think I can understand it in college and in your adolescents and the millennials as well. It's a hard time when you leave your home and you have to figure out if you fit in or not. That's a really hard time. And social isolation comes quick, and with that comes loneliness, and you begin to doubt yourself and doubt sort of what you're doing and how you're doing it. So please, as you look at these and look at these tests, please don't leave that population out when you start thinking about how to address loneliness with your own clients. The final one of the three assessments is called the Campaign to End Loneliness. This is interesting. This comes from England, and it has only positive language. As an example, it says, "I am content." And you have to agree or disagree. Whereas the loneliness scales for UCLA, as an example, "I feel left out." So how this assessment tool is addressing loneliness is having people see the positive. So even if they aren't there yet, what they're aiming for is that positive feeling that starts to be expressed to them from the moment they do the assessment. And if you think about the commitment in Great Britain to address loneliness, probably not surprising that they created a tool that is a positive tool that invokes positive feelings. So what can be done? First off, we need to take advantage, and I appreciate this is hard to read, but you can get a copy of the slides. We need to take advantage of the therapeutic relationship. We need to identify the challenges with social integration. We need to reduce the negative thoughts that drive loneliness. And that's done at the PCP when you see your behavioral health clinician. At all times, that should be a focus. So that's kind of what we do now. We understand the problem. We may even do assessments and talk and work with people whose marriages have broken up, who have factors in their life that lead one to believe they may be lonely. But what we need to do is think outside that box. And we need to implement policy. We need to implement community organization, relationships at the individual level. We need to begin to address loneliness at every place we engage with people or should be engaging with people. Earlier, I indicated that not a lot of studies had been done with the IDD population and the loneliness in that population. The specifics of addressing their needs should include improving social skills to enhancing social supports, increasing opportunities for social contact, and finally, addressing sort of the deficits in social cognition and balancing them with connection. People who are neuroatypical have every ability to connect socially, have every ability to have a social network. We have to understand that, accept that, create questionnaires, create assessments that work with people who are nonverbal, who work with folks who may not be able to read but understand, that work with folks. Everybody knows how to communicate in one way or another. We need to start meeting people where they are, literally and figuratively, and finding out how they are and addressing it for who they are. We have to do this, whether the population is neurotypical or neuroatypical, whether the client is depressed or there is social isolation. That is what we have to do. That's what needs to get done. Another way of looking at this is in this pyramid. On one side, you're looking at population, the individual, the local community, and society. And on the other side, you're looking at what is the connection. The individuals are lonely. A local community could include family and friends, mental health practitioners, general practitioners, groups, voluntary organizations. And finally, and perhaps the one that will be hardest for us to ever grapple with, society that speaks to government stepping in and providing supports and providing the underpinnings of a process that will begin to address loneliness. It is not where I have no actual feelings about the right or wrong of what I'm about to say, but it is not perhaps surprising that it is in single pay systems where loneliness is being addressed. Is it that we are so focused on the disease that we lose sight of the problem? Are we focused on the diabetes or the high blood pressure that we forget to ask, are you lonely? Because if that's what it is, that has to change, and we have to be committed to that change, whatever the healthcare system is. And if that doesn't work for you, think about it this way. Those health problems probably cost hundreds of billions of dollars every year. If we could even reduce that by 10%, that would be a huge benefit to the folks who just look at dollars and cents. But could you imagine what it would be to that population of 54% who are lonely? It would be the beginnings of a campaign to end loneliness in the United States. Seems like a minor thing to pave to me, but that's just me. So the final thing that I really want to talk about today is social determinants of health. First off, I find it completely interesting that when CMS came out with social determinants of health, they failed to include anything about loneliness or social connection. That could speak to the 46% of people who think that it's my problem, not yours. There are states who have implemented social determinants of health who have failed to include loneliness, social isolation. My first plea is that we adopt social determination of health across 50 states. My second plea is that we understand that each of the domains actually speaks to loneliness in different ways. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So there are indirect effects of loneliness, and that could be food insecurity or housing insecurity. There are direct ones, that are specifically social connection and isolation. There are direct and indirect when you speak of depression, or people look at what is their health status. Implicit in that information could be a hint that people are lonely. So to address loneliness is broader than just, is there a connection to a person? Do you have a connection? Do you feel like you know somebody? What's really important as well is that you not only do social determinants of health, but if you find that a person is food insecure, you provide them with ideas on where to get food. If you find a person is housing insecure, you find out why and what we can do about it. If a person doesn't feel like their health care is okay, it doesn't matter if it is or it isn't. The important piece is the person feels that they're not okay. And it is in listening to that, which sometimes isn't said, you're going to find the real keys to loneliness. I know people who are lonely. But when I ask them how they are, the first thing they'll tell me is they're depressed. The first thing they'll tell me is they just don't feel well. The first thing they tell me is they just don't care to get out of bed. And I have to dig. And maybe when I dig a little more, I can get to the place where I hear they're lonely. And because they're lonely, they're scared. And because they're scared, they have really just stopped breathing. They've stopped getting up. They've stopped taking meds. They've stopped doing the things that will take care of themselves. Because when they're lonely, if you're lonely, then you're also lonely even though you're with yourself. Because loneliness isn't being alone. When I'm alone, I know I'm alone. I know there's no one around me. I'm comfortable with that. When I'm lonely, I don't see myself as being able to take care of myself and take care of that loneliness. I feel sorry for myself. I feel like everybody else knows somebody and I don't. When loneliness affects you, you will feel alone in a large crowd of people. And I'm betting every one of us at one time or another in our lives has felt alone in a large crowd of people. And what might have happened in that instant, if we lived in a different time, is somebody would have reached out, perhaps a total stranger, and said, hey, why don't you come here and sit down with me and let's talk? Might it have solved my loneliness? I don't know. But it would have been the road to that direction versus the standing still of how we treat loneliness right now in this country. I am suggesting, through the use of social determinants of health, through the use of a more proactive healthcare system, through the use of the loneliness scales, that we begin to identify loneliness and don't be afraid to address loneliness. Because what will happen if we do those things is we will find a country where people live longer, where people are happier, where people have less illness and behavioral risks. We'll actually find the population of that group of lovely ladies around a table at lunch in England. Every time I look at that picture, I wish I could go to that lunch because it looks like fun. I'm just suggesting we start having lunches like that here at home. So at this time, that concludes my presentation, but I am happy to answer any questions. So we're going to begin the Q&A. Just note that, as I said earlier, there is a bibliography that will give you all the reading that's done, including the studies about the folks in England and other things that I've read to put this presentation and others together. So thanks, and I look forward to answering your questions.
So we're going to start answering some questions, and I have gotten a few. And
please feel free to enter some more as you have them. The first question is, how do you move the culture towards a holistic assessment and care? That's a great question, and one that I have thought about a lot. The challenge is first to help, I think, culture understand the problems that there is with loneliness and social isolation, and maybe finding ways to identify it, point it out, and help people understand that it is something more than just a perception or some behavior that belongs to those people and not to those people. But really, I think it's going to take a concerted effort by social institutions, by medical practices, by clinical providers, using the tools that we have to identify it and getting tools together to better address it when it's found. One of the things I could say is that social determinants of health 5 years ago were never discussed, and now they're discussed oftentimes by medical providers, by clinical providers, by social welfare kinds of groups as an important tool in doing the kind of work that they do and bringing together some of those factors. So hopefully, as social determinants of health gain even more traction and loneliness is added to make sure that it's a dimension of the social determinants of health, we'll see sort of a more holistic approach. What is your perspective on how shame may relate to loneliness? I don't know that I'd call it shame. I think many might say that there's a certain stigma related to that subjective sense. If you think you're lonely, whatever it makes you feel that makes you feel that way is potentially stigmatizing or maybe shame-producing, embarrassing, or maybe it's just so sort of focused on self and really not aware of what's around you. I think social isolation, generally it's not people don't ascribe shame to that. It's really more of not having a social network for whatever reasons. Perhaps your social skills aren't there, or for other reasons, or you have no family and you've moved to a new place. I've spoken to someone whose daughter went to London to go to school and really had no friends. She's not ashamed of being an American in London. She just really hadn't had a chance to develop a social network. So I'm not sure it's shame as it relates to the loneliness, although there could be stigma, I think, that relates to it. Has there been any research on the connection of social isolation to the growing addiction problem plaguing many of our communities? No, there really hasn't been that kind of research done. And but there are connections generally in some of the studies I've read to loneliness and some of the behavioral results of loneliness being addiction. Now that is something that could make you feel less like you can be part of what's out there, or that people just don't get you or people don't understand. So in that subjective way that loneliness exists, it may fuel that addiction, or may, again, we don't know cause and effect. It may fuel the addiction, or the addiction may fuel that feeling of loneliness. What contributes mostly to loneliness, depression? Would it be withdrawing because of the experiences or lack of social skills? Because loneliness is subjective, it could be any of those things. Now, I think earlier I talked about the fact that we really don't know what comes first. Depression causes loneliness, loneliness causes depression. Because of the population that's lonely, it could be life experiences. It could be just sort of their outlook, the the brain, the mind, how it relates to what's around them that makes them lonely. The absence of social skills certainly could play a part in that, and certainly there have been studies about folks where social skills are missing. They're less likely to reach out and likely to be lonely. Now the dependency is whether do they perceive themselves as lonely or do they just perceive themselves as alone? And I think that it's hard to say, hard to know what the right answer is there. Can you relate loneliness to social anxiety? I think that's a very similar kind of question. Certainly you can have social anxiety, but still force yourself out into, and I know people that do this, while they have social anxiety that's fairly profound, they still force themselves into social relations. Now what happens is they may not get out of those social relationships what somebody without social anxiety gets, but there is not necessarily a connection between social anxiety and loneliness because they're not necessarily as an unwillingness to participate. But do remember that loneliness can exist when you are surrounded by people. So again, I think it's going to be much more dependent on the person than necessarily the description or the social anxiety. What do you do with the fact that so often people with mental illness are shunned in their communities? They are seen as too much or too depressing to healthy individuals. How do you address that? Well, I think that's what they've done in the programs where they've tried to address social isolation and loneliness. They've done it with a population that probably had prior to been shunned or kept out or made to feel not a part or made to feel a stigma of their diagnoses. And they've had success because the people who have done the work they're perceived as not judgmental, as engaging, and as a desire to engage. They are folks who have been given the tools maybe, or just have them naturally, to see the person, not the diagnosis, not the disease, not the challenges. So that's why it's worked. And that's what's worked when it's worked in the United States for the programs discussed. It is with people who don't see a disease but see people. I think the issue of the fact that there's so many people in the United States who don't believe that loneliness is a real thing, but rather rather in the mind of the lonely, is a problem. And the problem, I think, is best defined as the questioner defined in the means of the question, that it is up to us to help people understand that a person has value and should never be defined by the diagnoses they have. And that prejudice is one we have to go after, both for people who are lonely, people who are mentally ill, people who heretofore have been shunned in their communities. It's up to people who see that as wrong to really go out and make right in that situation and help others understand. Again, it's that holistic. If we don't start it slowly but grow on it, we'll never address that. And that's really, I think, what's important. I think that I don't have enough time to go through any of the other questions, but I will be happy to get the questions and provide answers in an appropriate manner. I really want to thank you for joining with me this afternoon and remind you that at the end of the PowerPoint, which you have access to, is a full bibliography. If ever you need one of those slides or have any questions that I didn't address or you didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to reach out to me. You have my email address, and I look forward to responding to your questions or continuing this discourse in any way you see fit. Thank you all very much.